Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us for our October Fireside Chat. For those of you that may be new to this, we hold these on the third Wednesday of every month and invite you to join Northwest Natural Resource Group, our partners, and fellow forest stewards to discuss forest management topics, share information and resources relevant to those, and connect with others who may face some of the same challenges and opportunities as you do in stewarding your forests. These are really intended to be casual, so we spend the first 30 minutes or so with the presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion after that. When we get to that point, you can just I'll call on people or feel free to drop your questions in the chat and I'll read those out. So this month, we are joined by Max Ross, the State Resource Soil Scientist with NRCS Washington. He's going to share with you the Web Soil Survey, a tool that we at NNRG often recommend to people. And, I know that once you learn to use that, there's just a lot of information in there to explore that can help you in managing your forests. And so, you know, Max, we really appreciate you joining us to share this with the forest owners we work with and practitioners as well. And so I'll turn things over to you to get started. Thanks for being here.
All right, great. Yeah, thanks for the intro. Yep, hi everyone. Like Laura said, my name is Max. I'm with Washington State NRCS. So I just started this new role as the State Resource Soil Scientist. But prior to this, I spent 8 years with the Soil Survey Division, where it's like my primary job to actually make and edit and manage the soil surveys that are published on Web Soil Survey. And now in the new job, I focus a little bit more on like the application of that data as well as like the training and outreach side of things as well. So I'm excited to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about how what goes into soil surveys, like how they're made, what types of data they contain, and how that data should and could be used. And then I'll do a walkthrough of kind of a typical like session of using Web Soil Survey, everything from setting your area of interest to looking at and understanding the soil map, and then looking at some of the reports and interpretations that are available as well. All right, so I typically start any soils related presentation with this slide. So I know tonight I'm not really talking a whole lot about like soil properties in particular, but soil mapping, of course, contains data pertaining to soil properties and how those properties are interpreted. And so I really want to establish the idea that soils are a function of their environment, and the soil properties associated with those soils are going to be different and develop in different manners based on the environments that they're formed in. So way back in 1953, a soil scientist by the name of Hans Jenny published a paper in which he identified what we now refer to as the 5 soil forming factors. And it's basically like the 5 environmental categories that influence how soils develop and how soil properties are formed. So those 5 factors are going to be climate, so that's your long-term weather patterns. The second one is organisms, so that's pretty much everything living. So everything from like the microorganisms living in the soil biosphere to earthworms to plants and the organic matter that those plants input into the soil to like large mammals, to like human impact and like human related disturbance. So all of that plays a role in how soils develop. The third is going to be the parent material. So that's the actual like mineralogical material that the soil develops from. So in Washington, we have a handful of examples that are kind of more common than others. So one of them is going to be alluvium. So that's sediment that got deposited as a result of rivers or other like water bodies flooding. We have a lot of glacial outwash in Washington State, especially on the west side. So that's material that got dumped and deposited as a result of glaciers receding and the floodwaters associated with that. And then up in our higher elevation areas, like our mountains, we have like residuum, so that's just bedrock that has weathered in place. And we have some areas with pretty high amounts of volcanic ash as well. The fourth category is going to be our topography. So that's where on the landscape and where on like landscape positions that the site is and the site in which that soil is developing. So a soil that develops up on like the summit of a mountain is going to look much different than the soil that develops on the foot slope or the toe slope of that like mountain flank. The last category is time. So time allows for these other 4 categories to play out. And time also refers to the disturbance intervals that kind of reset the development of soil. So like large disturbance events like floods or volcanic eruptions that kind of deposit a whole bunch of new material on the surface and kind of reset that soil developmental process. So kind of as I was getting at, those five categories of environmental conditions are going to influence what we refer to as soil morphology and soil properties. So it's basically how the soil appears and soil properties that can be like measured quantitatively. So I have a whole bunch of examples listed here, things like soil color, texture, organic matter content, the depth to the water table, the frequency and duration of flooding and ponding, and a whole bunch of other examples as well. And these soil features, these soil properties, they're going to have interpretive value as well. So based on the amount of like clay you have in a soil, that soil is going to like hold water differently than a soil that has like a bunch of sand. And that sort of data is what we incorporate into our soil survey products. So just like a quick example of how those like 5 soil forming factors act in real life. I've a site here shown on the left of the Skagit River Valley up in Skagit County. So this is a soil profile like pretty close to the river. So we have alluvial parent material. It's a relatively young soil because every time that river floods, it's going to deposit like a new layer or a couple layers of material on the surface. So the soil is kind of like continually building upwards. Of course, the topography is going to play a role in how this soil develops because it's located on a floodplain, like adjacent to the river. And you can kind of see like how those environmental conditions affect the soil itself. So the soil shown on the right, you see a pretty thin surface horizon that's not super dark, not like a ton of organic matter in there. And then you can see the horizontal stratification of those different flood deposits, those kind of horizontal stratified layers of like rocks, sands, and gravels. All right, so just one more example. So this site here is up in the Cascades, Mount Baker National Forest to be specific. And the soil profile associated with it is going to be in like one of these alpine meadows on kind of in the higher elevation areas of these mountains. So the climate is going to play a role here. It's, higher elevations typically can be pretty cold. We're going to have a little bit less like microbial activity, and that's going to slow down the breakdown of organic carbon. So you can kind of see how that affects the soil. You have a much thicker and darker like surface horizon that's pretty rich in organic matter. The topography plays a role here. It's a lower slope area with a bunch of higher slope areas above it. So we have material coming down that hill and resting on this site. So you can kind of see in the upper part of the soil profile, there's like less rock fragments that you see in the lower part. And then time is going to play a factor here as well. This is a pretty old mountain range. The soil has had a lot of time to like weather in place, and you have a pretty deep, well-developed soil profile occurring here. Okay, so those are just like 2 quick examples of how like the environmental conditions lead to and affect the development of soils and how the soil properties associated with that might be relevant to sorts of like use and management. So, we're all here tonight because we have some sort of interest in like natural resource management, and soils and knowledge of soils and soil properties is going to play a role in natural resource management, especially from a forestry perspective. So what are some ways that you can get to know your soil, get information about your soil? Well, the first and easiest one is to just take a look at the landscape, find a representative spot in that landscape, and like dig a small hole. Like, what do you see? Get some indication of the soil color, the soil texture, the soil structure. We have like worksheets and flow charts pertaining to soil health indicators that you can work through. We also have like field worksheets related to potential like management issues and soil resource concerns that you could work through. Another way to get information about your soil is to just get a soil test done. So this is especially good for like nutrient balances and things of that nature, like organic carbon content, things that are better measured in a lab than observed in a field. And the last kind of option that one would have would be to reference soil survey data. So we publish soil survey data online via the platform called Web Soil Survey. It's completely free. It's available to the public. And it can be a really good resource, especially when compared to on-the-ground observations and proposed and potential management activities on a site. Okay, so what is a soil survey? Well, despite the name soil survey, a soil survey is actually a comprehensive resource inventory that accounts for a whole bunch of Earth's systems. So within a soil survey, we have data that pertains to climate, temperature and moisture regimes, hydrology, so flooding and ponding. Soil surveys also incorporate landforms and parent material and geology and mineralogy, as well as ecology. We have ecological sites that correlate to the soils in our soil surveys. And then, of course, the soil survey is also going to incorporate soil types, soil classifications, and the soil properties and interpretations associated with those. So modern soil surveys, the ones that we publish online via Web Soil Survey, have three main components to them. So the first is going to be the spatial products. That's going to be the actual soil map. And that's going to be, the actual spatial delineations of soil map units. Then we have the tabular product. So that's all of the data that is stored in a big database that is then geo-encoded into the spatial product. So each of the map units that you see on the map has a whole bunch of data that is tied to it that contains information about the soils that comprise that map unit, the soil classifications and soil properties associated with those soils, as well as the interpretations associated with those soils, which leads me to the third and final part of a soil survey, which is our interpretations. So interpretations are essentially scientific models or calculations that are based on soil and site properties. And the goal of our interpretations is to provide some sort of information or some informed guidance pertaining to specific management practices. So some of the interpretations that we have include things like suitability for fencing, suitability for building roads, for building log landings, tree site index for various tree species that are relevant within a certain geographic area. We also have land classification, so the whole prime farmland idea, that is a model based on the soil and site properties. And we also have summary reports of general soil property categories, things like soil health, soil physical properties, water features, that you can get a whole bunch of information pertaining to soil properties within a particular category of interest. All right, so one of the more common questions I get is, how are soil surveys made? So I've kind of simplified this down to a 5-step process. So first is the identification of a legend and map unit design. So this is where we identify relevant classes and combinations of classes of those 5 soil forming factors. And by relevant, I mean things that are influential to soil classification or ecology or land use or the interpretations, things along those lines for the soil survey area. So the second is the spatial. So that's when we start actually building the soil map and delineating those map unit concepts that we have identified in step 1. So we use LiDAR imagery, high resolution ortho imagery, a whole bunch of spatial derivatives from the ortho imagery and the LiDAR, things like topographic maps, different types of infrared filters to identify vegetation types. We use climate models to identify temperature and moisture regimes. All of the data that we have available to us to delineate those map unit concepts that we've identified on a conceptual basis. Step 3 is the field work. So this is when we go out into the field, we go into those map units that we've delineated, and we observe and document the site and soil properties within those delineations. So the main goal of this is to determine what the soil components are within those map units. And then also while we're out in the field, we work to confirm the accuracy of the map unit lines that we've delineated. Basically, we do ground truthing. Step 4 is basically to repeat that process, to go back and look at the legend, make any edits. Once we have information about the soils within a map unit, we can kind of add that. We can add that information to the map unit legend. We'll refine the spatial. We'll go back out in the field and conduct more field work. And we'll repeat that process several times up until the point that we're satisfied with the product. And then it'll go through some sort of quality, not some sort of, it'll go through a very specific and detailed quality assurance and review process, and then it'll be published on Web Soil Survey. So a quick example of how we design a map unit. So this is from Olympic National Park. Prior to accepting this new position with Washington NRCS, I was with Soil Survey And I spent the last 4 years working as the project lead for the soil survey of Olympic National Park, which had a really complicated legend just based on all of the geographic variability and the variability within those 5 soil forming factors. So this is just an example of like one map unit within that legend and how it was selected. So I have the 5 soil forming factors listed across the top: the climate, topography, parent material, the organisms or biota, and time. So within the climate category, we have temperature and moisture regimes. So in this case, I've selected the frigid temperature regime and the eutic moisture regime. Under the topography category for landscape, we have mountains, river valleys, and glacial hills in the Olympics. For this example, I've selected mountains. And then within those mountains, I've selected the colluvial apron landform. The parent material is going to be metasedimentary rock. The source of that is going to be colluvial, meaning it moved downslope due to gravity. The organisms or the biota relevant to this site is going to be our frigid forest community. And then as far as time goes, I've selected the specific type of metasedimentary rock, which provides an age. And then this particular map unit doesn't have any sort of like large disturbance associated with it. So it doesn't frequently flood. We don't really deal with a frequent fire regime in the Olympics. And so based on all of these categories and the selection within, you can see here in the bottom left, I have a screenshot from the project legend. So this is our map unit 6320 for the Olympic National Park project. The conceptual name of that map unit is going to be our frigid utic colluvial aprons with streams and drainages, 0 to 65% slopes. Our technical map unit name is going to be comprised of the actual soils that make up this map unit. So in this case, it's going to be the Bonjon Pass, Skookum Creek, and Lapowet Creek complex. And you can see the information pertaining to the percent of the map unit that those soils occupy, as well as their taxonomic classifications listed below. And then the images surrounding that screenshot of the legend just kind of provide like a little bit of an idea of how like consistent we are able to get with, identifying and delineating these map unit concepts. So the upper left here is a selection of all of this map unit, all of these 6320 map units within the Olympic National Park survey. The yellow box is kind of a zoomed in area, and you can see the polygons in the yellow box when shown over the LiDAR, as well as the slope map, which is here on the upper right, show that these map units are delineated, pretty consistently as far as like where they occur on the landform. The photo on the bottom right, you can see that like the vegetation tone is like pretty consistent within these as well. And the idea is that when you have the same grouping of those 5 soil forming factors, is you are going to have the same soil or suite of soils occurring within a soil survey area where you can identify and delineate those areas. Okay, so that was just like one example of a map unit from a soil survey that was worked on recently. So I just kind of want to reiterate that soil surveys incorporate like a whole bunch of data pertaining to site properties, like as well as soil properties and soil types. So let's kind of transition this conversation and talk a little bit more about how soil survey data can be accessed and used for like management and planning purposes. So the next like 18, 20 slides or so of this presentation basically serve as like an instruction manual for like walking through the process of using web soil survey. So this is kind of what I would do personally if I was looking up soil survey data, as well as recommend to any peers that were doing the same. So a typical web soil survey session is going to involve setting your area of interest, accessing your soil map, looking at and understanding the map unit description, accessing interpretations and reports within your area of interest, and then compiling all of that information into a final report that you can download and have for future reference. So the very first step in starting a web soil survey session is to get to web soil survey. So the easiest way to do this is to just Google web soil survey. It should be the first link. The home page is going to look like this. There's going to be a big green button that says Start Web Soil Survey, and that is going to be what you click. So after clicking that button, this is what your screen should look like. And the first thing you need to do is set an area of interest. So essentially, we have soil survey data that exists for the entire United States. And the spatial data and all of the tabular data that's like geo-encoded into that spatial data is a lot of information. It's too much information for someone to access for the entire country all at once. So instead of looking up the soil mapping for everything that we have soil mapping for, you set an area of interest. You basically identify an area, and once that area is identified, you're essentially pulling the soil data for that area. So there's a couple ways you can set an area of interest. You can just zoom around on the map like you would on like Google Maps or Google Earth. If you have a particular like set of GPS points or an address, there's some options for selecting your area of interest on this like navigation pane to the left. Usually what I do, if I'm familiar with the property I'm working in, I'll typically like select the state and county just to kind of zoom me into the general vicinity. And then from there, I'll zoom into the particular property I'm interested in. And these tools here on the upper left are going to be what you use to zoom around. So the magnifying glass will zoom you in. I don't know what you call the opposite of a magnifying glass, but the one with the minus sign will zoom you out. And then the hand, you can pan around on the map. So after you've zoomed into the area that you want to pull the soil mapping for, and generally speaking, the soil survey data is most useful when you select an area of interest between like 10 and like 15, 20,000 acres. It's pretty useful. If you zoom a little bit too far out, the data can become a little bit too generalized. And if you zoom too far in, you're essentially trying to use the data for a purpose that is more specific than what it was designed for. So we kind of try to, I recommend people kind of try to look at the soil mapping for, a reasonable scale within that like 10 to 10,000 acre range. So once you've zoomed in to the area you want to get your mapping for, you are going to use one of these two boxes here with the red symbols to actually draw your area of interest. So the one on the left is just a rectangle, so you can drag and drop a rectangle. The one on the right, you can draw a more specific polygon feature. So after you either draw that rectangular polygon feature, your area of interest will be set, and you'll know it will be set because that polygon that you drew will be shaded with this like blue stripe symbology. So once you see this blue stripe symbology, that means your area of interest has been set, and you can move forward with looking at your soil map and the soil data and interpretations associated with it. So the next step is to select the soil map tab on the top. So the first tab you're going to be in is that area of interest tab. Select the soil map tab to actually view your soil map. And then the map unit legend is going to show on the left, and that's basically going to be the information pertaining to each of the map unit symbols that you see on the map. So this site here is a site I use pretty commonly for like teaching and training purposes. It's a piece of Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife land down in Grace Harbor County, so not really showing anyone's private property and information associated with it here. Also, this mapping was updated in like the mid 2010s, like 2014 or 15 or so. This mapping was refreshed, so I like using it and referencing it for these purposes. So a couple important things to note about soil map units. So first of all, a map unit is defined as an area that is defined and named the same in terms of the soil components within them. Generally speaking, a map unit is going to have this, like the example I gave for Olympic National Park, a map unit is going to have the same groupings of those 5 soil forming factor categories. It's also important to note that a map unit often contains more than one soil in it. Oftentimes, there's too much variability on the landscape for us to cut out every tiny little microfeature that would have a specific soil associated with it. So what we do is we draw a larger polygon around, maybe like 2 or 3 combinations of microfeatures that each have a soil associated with it. And then we'll create a map unit that will have those 3 soils within it. That's not always the case. Sometimes we'll have soil map units that just have like one dominant soil in it. And the example here on the right has examples of both of those situations. Like this 1221 map unit, these are like poorly drained soils and these like little swales. So that's just going to have like the one poorly drained soil in it. Whereas these 1224 map units, kind of have this like rolling hill topography in which there's multiple soils within them. It is also important to note that, well, two more things. For one, the map unit description, accessed via the left of the web soil survey page, provides the specific details about the different soil components and where those soil components are likely to occur on the landform. And I'll provide an example of that here in a moment. And then one more thing that I actually left off the slide that you can obviously see here in the example is that it is very common for map units to repeat themselves within a soil survey. So where we have these like depressional swales, it's, map unit 1221. Everywhere that landform feature exists within the soil survey area has the same map unit. Sometimes that confuses people that, the same thing is mapped in multiple places, but that is perfectly normal and to be expected. All right, so on to the map unit description. So viewing and understanding the map unit description is probably one of the most important parts of like accessing and utilizing soil survey information. So when you're looking at the soil map tab, the map unit legend will be here on the left, and all of the map unit names that are shown in blue are actually hyperlinks that can be clicked on to bring up the map unit description. So the example that we're going to use here for the next handful of slides is going to be this map unit 1224. The name of this map unit is the Chehalis-Maytown Complex with 0 to 10% slopes. All right, so we click on that blue link, and that'll bring up our map unit description. This slide here kind of has a breakdown of the different parts of a map unit description. So I'll kind of start at the top. So at the very top, you'll have the map unit symbol and the map unit name. Below that, you'll have the map unit setting. It'll give you some general information about precipitation, temperature, things like that. And then below all of that, you'll have information on each of the components. So the dominant component in this map unit is the Chehalis soil series. The map unit composition will let you know that. So Chehalis and similar soils, 55%. It'll give you the landforms and general setting that you'd expect to find the soil on, as well as a brief soil profile description and some general soil properties and qualities that are kind of good things to look at for ground truthing purposes. So for example, this soil is occasionally flooded. I believe it is a well-drained soil, so we don't have a water table coming up close to the surface. So if you were to go out in the field and take a look at this soil for like ground truthing purposes, those are a couple things you could look at. Evidence of whether or not it floods occasionally, and evidence of whether or not that water table is coming up close to the surface. Okay, so this note here, I just had to interject it in here somewhere. But at any point during a web soil survey session that you come across something that you're interested in and want to reference it later, you can essentially build like a PDF document. And how you do that is on any page you're on, all you have to do is click this add to shopping cart button. So you can do it with the soil map. If you do it with the soil map, the map unit description will automatically be included. You can do it with any of the reports or interpretations, but all you have to do is click that add to shopping cart button, and the program will start building you a PDF that you can download at the end of your session. Okay, so after we've set our area of interest and looked at our soil map and pulled the map unit description and reviewed that, the next step is to start looking at the interpretations. So that is going to be done in the Soil Data Explorer tab. And within the Soil Data Explorer tab, there's 4 subtabs that will give you interpretive data within different categories. So the first is going to be suitabilities and limitations for use. So this tab is going to give you a map and a report for some sort of land use interpretation. So things like forest productivity, suitability for building roads and fences, things like that. The second category is going to be soil properties and qualities. So that is also going to produce a map and a report, but instead of it for being some sort of like land use or interpretation, it's going to be for a single soil property. So kind of just like factual information about the soil. So examples of that would be like depth to water table, clay content, sand or silt content, organic matter content, just kind of factual information about the soil. The third category is going to be soil reports. So that's going to produce a pretty comprehensive report and associated tables that have multiple soil properties and interpretations associated with them. So one example of that I'll show later is the hydric soils report. The last category is the ecological site assessment. So for every soil component in a soil survey, NRCS has an ecological site correlated to it. Ecological sites are pretty complex documents. They're around like 40 to 50 pages. And they characterize an ecological site for every stage of succession. So basically what an ecological community will look like after like a major disturbance event, through every stage of succession to where that or what that site will look like at its like final seral stage of succession. So in Washington State, the majority of our ecological sites are still going through the review process. So if you look at the ecological site assessment tab in Soil Survey, you'll typically be able to get the ecological site name, but the link to the ecological site like website to have access to that full document typically is not available yet for most areas in Washington State. But hopefully in the next year or so, that data will become available. All right, so let's take a look at one of these interpretations that I recommend pretty strongly for folks involved in forest management. And that is going to be our forest productivity interpretation, and in particular, our tree site index. So within the suitabilities and limitations for use tab, you're going to go to the category vegetative productivity, and within that category, you're going to select the forest productivity interpretation. So the tree site index interpretation is fairly simple. You're going to set a couple options. So the basic options is going to be the tree species you're interested in. So in this case, we're going to look at the tree site index for Douglas fir. And then there's some advanced options as well, which I'll talk about more in a second here. But long story short, I always recommend just using this dominant condition option for the aggregation method. Essentially, that is because if you use dominant condition, it'll calculate your report based on the dominant soil condition or the soil property that influences that interpretation, as opposed to simply what the most dominant soil in that map unit is. So a lot of times what will happen is a situation like this where we'll have three soils in a map unit, soil A, B, and C. A and B will be 30% of that map unit each. Soil C will be 40%. Well, let's just say for the sake of the example that soil A and B are poorly drained at 30% each, and soil C is well drained. Well, if you use the dominant component option, you're going to get a report based off of the soil C information because 40% is obviously greater than the 30% associated with the other two soils. But then you're going to end up with a result that's not really indicative of the largest part of, the map unit. So yeah, long story short, I always recommend using dominant condition. Some people like to use a weighted average, but I also recommend against using that one because instead of getting a report or an interpretation that's indicative of one of the actual site conditions, you'll get something that's kind of like an average of everything, which often isn't super helpful. Okay, so once we set those options, all you have to do is click the View Rating button, and you will see a map, thematic map for your tree site index. And this little button here that says Legend, you click on that and that'll pull up the legend associated with the map. You can also scroll down below the map to see a table of the legend as well. So let's say, this is your property and this big map unit here, this 1224 map unit, you're considering planting Douglas fir in. So you run this report, you see your map, you scroll below the map to view the summary table. You look at map unit 1224, Chehalis Maytown Complex. It's always good just to confirm that the name correlates to the map unit symbol. And in this case, the tree site index rating is 130, which is quite good. That basically means that Doug fir would be expected to grow to 130 feet tall in a 50-year period, which is very good. So in this case, this report would give you a pretty good indication that Doug fir would do pretty well on this site if you were to plant it. So that's just one example of the many reports and interpretations available in Web Soil Survey. I think there's close to 200 options now that we have built into the program at this point. So this slide here is a great reference. It has the three categories. suitabilities and limitations for use, soil properties and qualities, and soil reports. And then it has some subcategories within those, and then specific reports and interpretations within those subcategories that I think are, more relevant to like forest management and forest planning than others. So I have them all listed here. I'm not necessarily going to read them all, but this is where you would find these listed reports and interpretations. Basically, to kind of use or reference this page, if you see a report or an interpretation listed here, just work backwards to find it. So say you're interested in available water capacity. If that's what you want to know, go to soil properties and qualities, soil physical properties, and then available water capacity will be one of your options within there. I'm going to show one more example. So this is the hydric soils report. This is another really good one that I recommend people reference. This is really good for properties you own. If folks are interested in buying a piece of land or leasing a piece of land, in Washington State, hydrology is probably the biggest driver of like land use interpretations. And the hydric soils report, it's basically going to tell you where you have hydric soils and how many hydric soils you have, or what percent of your map unit is comprised of hydric soils. I'm not saying that hydric soils are a bad thing by any means. Hydric soils are associated with wetlands, which perform, really important ecological functions. But for, most like marketable timber species, hydric soils can be pretty limiting. And for most like development purposes as well, like building houses with basements, things like that, hydric soils can be limiting for that as well. So I think it's a pretty important thing to know about a property before you start, either purchasing it or managing it. So the hydric soils report is pretty simple. It's going to be under the soil reports subtab, under land classifications, hydric soils. This option or this report doesn't have any specific options, so all you have to do is just find the report and then just click the button to view it. When you do, you're not going to get a thematic map, but what you are going to get is a table that will have each of the map units within your area of interest, and it'll tell you which of the components in those map units qualify as a hydric soil and the percent of that map unit that is hydric. So this is kind of what you expect to look like. And then hydric soils have different criteria associated with them. I can't remember them offhand, but they're listed at the bottom of this report as well. And the specific hydric criteria associated with each of the hydric soils in this report are listed on the far right there. All right. So after you've gone through all of these steps, and remember, at every stage that you're interested in, the report or the interpretation that you pulled, all you have to do is just click that Add to Shopping Cart button. And at the very end, you go to the Shopping Cart tab. I don't know why they use the phrasing shopping cart, because it kind of insinuates like you're gonna have to pay something, but I assure you, you don't. This tool and the service is 100% free to the public for use. You just click on that shopping cart tab, you go to the checkout button. If the report you compiled is fairly small, typically if it has just the soil map and like 4 or 5 reports or less, it'll be small enough that you can just download it immediately. If you put like 15 or 20 reports in there and it's like a massive document, that get now option will typically be grayed out and you'll have to download it later. And it basically will just send you an email like 10 minutes later with the report attached. But that's really all you have to do. You just hit the checkout button, select your delivery option, hit OK. And then you'll have a comprehensive report available to you. So just a handful of concluding statements. So first of all, despite everything I've just said and talked about and all the hype I've just given to soil survey products, I just want folks to remember that soil survey products are a guide. They're not like gospel. They are not 100% accurate all the time. There's a handful of reasons for that. One of them being that soil surveys are a snapshot in time. So most areas are mapped once and they're not really mapped again, at least for a very long time. So in Washington, we have a lot of soil survey areas which were done by county that were mapped in like the 70s and 80s. And things change in 40 years. In like river valleys, like rivers move, land use changes, land ownership changes. And so a soil survey that was made in the 1970s and 1980s, might not be 100% accurate, 40 years later based on potential land and land use changes. Another thing to mention is that, and reiterate, is that understanding the map unit composition and the map unit description is really important for utilizing and applying the soil survey for like management purposes. Lastly, before the soil survey data is used for management purposes, you have to ground truth it. You have to go out in the field and confirm that the soils on the ground resemble what is mapped, because if not, you could be using data from reports and interpretations that wouldn't be applicable. So look up your soil mapping, go out in the field to get a rough idea. The conservation districts, NRCS staff can assist with this, but get some sort of confirmation that the mapping is accurate before you use it for management purposes. And then lastly, a question that I commonly get is, what do I do if the soil mapping and my on-site observations are strongly contrasting? So, I kind of have like two general pieces of advice. First of all, review the map unit description and see if your observations resemble any sort of like minor component in the map unit. So minor components are kind of like oddball soils that occur within a soil survey area. They're typically associated with like micro topography sites, so like little swales or depressions or like rock outcrops, things like that. So if you do some sort of on-site observation and that observation is in a location that isn't super representative of the site as a whole, check and see if that observation and the soil you're looking at resembles a minor component. If things still aren't checking out, I recommend contacting an NRCS soil scientist or a resource soil scientist to discuss the situation. All situations are unique. I've worked through a lot of these types of situations with a lot of people under different circumstances, and if you have questions, they're worth asking. And speaking of questions, I'm at 40 minutes. I talked a little bit longer than I wanted to. I know that was a lot of information I threw at y'all, but if anyone has any questions about anything I just talked about, what goes into soil surveys, the methods, anything about the tool that I might have glazed over, feel free to ask. If you can't think of anything now, all of my contact info is shown right here. So you're welcome to call me or email me, and we can have a conversation at a later date.
Feel free to use the chat for your question, or if you use the hand raise feature under reactions at the bottom of the screen, I can call on you. And Max did share this presentation, so I'll send that out as well tomorrow to everybody. Any questions for him?
I can't find the hand raise thing, but I'll just ask.
Oh, we hear you.
Hi, Max. Thank you for the presentation. So I just pulled it up and drew a square around the area where my property is.
Mm-hmm.
So how do I get rid of that and then redraw that square somewhere like, a mile away?
Oh, yeah. So if you go to the area of interest tab, there should be an option under that says to clear your area of interest. So
Okay, let's see.
I'm still
Oh
sharing
yeah,
my
okay,
screen,
area of
right?
interest. Yeah, I see.
You are, yeah.
Clear.
Yep.
AOI.
Yep, clear AOI, and that should
Okay.
allow you to draw a new one.
All
It
right.
happens to me all the time. I'll accidentally like draw a rectangle around like the wrong property or whatever, and it's pretty simple fix.
Cool.
Good
Thank you.
question.
Yeah, and I definitely have made the mistake of forgetting to switch between the zoom in and out before I start clicking, and then it does the opposite of what I want. So just,
Oh, yeah.
those buttons he showed at the top, it's important to remember to click them before you. Oh, that one gets me a lot. Any other questions for Max?
While folks are thinking of questions, I'll just kind of add that, the like Laura said, the presentation can be sent out to y'all, and the second half the web soil survey screenshots, that was designed to serve as like an instruction manual for using web soil survey. So if any of you want to try it at a later date, I'd recommend like downloading the presentation and just kind of having that in one place and just kind of working through those steps. Because there is a little bit of a learning curve to it, but after you go through it a few times, it gets easier, I promise.
Yeah. Lisa, I see you have your hand up. If you want to unmute and ask
Yeah,
away.
so this was kind of an introduction for me, so it's hard to come up with questions. I think I'm going to need to go and play with the tool a little bit more. But if I am looking for a property and I got a tree species that I want to see how well it would do, and I'm looking in certain areas, how would you best go about looking for kind of an areas you want to target within Washington for that tree to be successful?
Oh man, that is a good question. So within the soil survey tool, that tree site index report is a pretty good one. So if you have like an area of interest, so if you're looking, well, to clarify, are you looking for areas within a certain property, or like are you looking on a broader scale?
No, I'm looking for redwood territory. So I'm kind of thinking I've got to look at both the climate as well as the
Mhm.
soil and the water. And
Yep.
so I'm kind of thinking like Quilcene up to Mount Vernon.
Okay.
And so I'm just like, okay, where should I be focused at? So
Yeah.
that's kind of, I'm trying to see it through the soil lens and trying to figure out how best to use this tool so
Yeah.
that I'm not wasting my time looking at properties that wouldn't support the successful growth of those trees.
Yeah, so you can kind of like trick the tool in a sense. So since redwoods aren't like a native species to Washington, that's not going to be an option under that tree site index tool. But what you can do is you can identify like 2 or 3 soil and climatic properties that redwoods would do well in. And because they're not a native, I don't really know what those would be. But let's say redwoods like well-drained soil and like a mesic, xeric temperature moisture regime. So knowing those 3 things, what you can do is you can run the web soil survey report for temperature regime, for moisture regime, and for drainage class, and you can look for areas in which you have the temperature moisture regime that you're looking for as well as the drainage class.
And would you start kind of by zooming out to that area that I talked about? That would be your area of interest, and then you would zoom in after you run the reports.
Yeah, so the maximum size for an area of interest is 100,000 acres, just because of how much data is incorporated into the soil survey. So if you have like a general area, like you said, like around Quilcene, like I mean, 100,000 acres is a lot of space. So yeah, you could draw like 100,000 acre rectangle, in that general Quilcene Squim area, and you know pick a couple reports or interpretations that like I said, there isn't one for redwoods, but you can identify soil properties that correlate to how redwoods would do, and you can run the reports for those and kind of narrow your scope that way. But there isn't really a way via the web soil survey tool to do this on like a super broad scale. There is ways to do it, but that gets into like downloading the web soil survey data. Not the web, it gets into downloading like entire county soil surveys, and you have to have like access to GIS and things like that. But if that situation applies to you, you can email me or call me outside of this chat, and I can kind of walk you through that process. It's fairly involved, but like it is doable.
All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, a couple in the chat. So Lee tried to use it on an iPhone and wasn't able to select a polygon. Are you
Yeah.
doing
No,
something wrong, or is it only computer based?
it is really difficult to draw an area of interest on a phone. Yeah, so it's not just you. Uh, Desktop or laptop is the best way to go. There is an app called Soil Web. It's like produced by UC Davis. It's free to use, and it doesn't have all of the reports and interpretations that Web Soil Survey does, but it does have the actual soil mapping. And on the Soil Web app, you can like identify your location, and it'll tell you like what the soil or soils are mapped at, like at your location. It's the same exact data as Web Soil Survey. It's connected to the same database. So you can use that on a phone. You have to download the app. It's called Soil Web. But the Web Soil Survey tool does not work well on a phone.
Thank you. And then Bob, I think, had a similar question to Lisa, how to identify understory species well suited to a site. So is there a separate sort of
Oh yeah,
search for that?
totally. So that is going to be, I'm just going to start a quick session here and just so I can share my screen. So there is going to be a couple reports or interps that you can pull like relevant to like the ecology stuff if the ecological site data isn't available. So I just drew like a random area of interest. If you go to the Soil Data Explorer, there is going to be, I believe it is under land classifications. There's this conservation tree and shrub group, ecological classification ID. Those are two fairly good ones to reference. Sometimes the conservation tree and shrub group isn't available everywhere. It just, some data is or isn't available based on like when the soil survey was produced.
The far left side of your screen is cut off on mine. I don't know if it's just me.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'm seeing it still.
So the top
Not
of
sure.
something development, the E. Ah, there we go.
Got
Thank
it.
you.
Okay, good.
So the ecological class ID, it's going to give you this like weird code that can be cross-referenced via the edit website. And it can be cross-referenced via like the forage suitability groups. So that will give fairly good indication, but the best tool for like identifying suitable like understory species is going to be like an ecological site description, which unfortunately it's a lot of them aren't available just quite yet, but we do have like most of them are written and they're in like draft status. So if anyone, has if you look up your ecological site name, like for example, this site here, it'll be like something like Puget Lowlands Moist Forest or Puget Lowlands Riparian Forest. You can like email me and request like the draft document of this, and there's a pretty good chance I could get you like a draft status, especially if you're just looking for like a list of like suitable understory species associated with the site. So there's there is an opportunity to get information there, but unfortunately it's not quite published yet. But there are several of these ecological related reports and interpretations under the land classifications tab. The vegetative productivity tab, for the most part, is geared towards like crop production and range production, but there are a couple for trees, but that's going to give you like information about like how productive certain tree species are, not how suitable they are.
Right. We have time for one more question if anybody has one. Somebody's sharing that they like rangeland and forest vegetation composition under the vegetative productivity in the soil reports. Finds that one helpful
And I just found
for understory.
the one I was looking for. So if you go to the ecological site tab, they just like kind of updated Web Soil Survey like not very long ago and added the ecological site tab. It used to be buried somewhere else. But if you go to ecological site tab, you can click on the ecological site name, and some of them are available. So for example, this one here is, and it'll give you a whole bunch of information about everything. Ecological dynamics, state and transition models. There's, your understory communities are listed there, and there'll be a whole bunch of narrative pertaining to how and why. So yeah, and that's going to be under ecological sites. So yeah.
Nice. Well, thank you, Max, for joining us tonight and sharing all this. I know there's a lot of great information in there. Encourage people to just start getting in there and playing around. And like I said, I'll share this presentation, which has his contact details in it, so you can reach out to him as you have questions. I will also post this presentation on NNRG's YouTube channel, so you can come back if you forgot something he shared and find it there. And yeah, thanks for joining us tonight. And we look forward to seeing everyone again next month. Thank you, Max. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.